seasons of giving. Today, discernment to understand the spiritual responsibility that you and I have in discerning not only is what is best and right for us, but what is best and right for the community and the church in which we serve. To remind ourselves that people before us had to discern those questions themselves, and that we are the beneficiaries. We are the beneficiaries of the folks who discerned that there needed to be change in the world, and that that change could be manifest even when the world believed that that change was not possible. 40 years ago, a young man, 20-odd years of age, believed that God had somehow convicted his life through spiritual wisdom that God loves everyone. And 40 years ago, that man, I'm sure, Reverend Perry, sat with that truth and with that knowledge and thought, well, how can that be? How can that truly be when all of his childhood into early adulthood, he had been told by the church of his tradition that he was going to hell in a handbasket? How could it truly be true if everybody he respected, everybody who he believed, everybody he looked up to, everybody in his family and his friends and the church that he grew up in had told him that to be homosexual, to be a practicing homosexual and a Christian were oxymorons? How could it be true if God was suddenly just revealing that to himself? And I'm sure Troy sat with that knowledge for a little while before he decided to act out on that knowledge. You know, this morning I was sharing with somebody who was at our 9 o'clock service, and he was, he's not here this morning, but when you sit in the office sometimes here, we're the founding church of this denomination, and Joe Wilsey, who's our administrator, and I were just talking this week because we're receiving a number of phone calls from folks who want to come to the 40th anniversary event. And we were sat talking, and we've had several phone calls who said, I was one of the original 12 who met with Troy in his living room on October the 6th, 1968. And, well, I said to Joel, Joel, if every single person who's ever phoned me and told me that they were one of the original 12 who met with Troy Perry in his front living room, there were a lot more than 12 people in that room that day. But I was sharing one of those guys. He was not one of the original 12. He came in a little bit later. He's old enough to admit that. But we were sharing about how different it was 40 years ago. How different the world was 40 years ago. And that he really wanted to lay upon my conscience, to lay upon my own discernment, my own spiritual wisdom, just how different the world was 40 years ago. 40 years ago, to be homosexual was a crime. Just to be homosexual. 40 years ago, my understanding is that some of those early organizations that were finding themselves were under scrutiny from the law. 40 years ago, they had not yet had Stonewall. Stonewall came just a year or so later. 40 years ago, many of our ancestors were still hiding underground in fear of their lives. 40 years ago, the world was very, very different. And to imagine 40 years ago when Reverend Perry, here in Los Angeles, put an ad in the LA Times saying, God loves everyone. Come and worship. And put his address. I mean, he didn't put some hall or some nightclub or some other place that he could have got in and out of. The fool put his own personal address where he lived and welcomed them to worship that day. 40 years ago. We still hear about hate crimes in our community. Imagine what it was like 40 years ago. Imagine what it was like 40 years ago when you came out and your mail would be read by the FBI or by the government for fear that you may be conspiring something else that's going on in this country. Because I understand that's exactly what happened 40 years ago in this world. 40 years ago. And yet spiritual discernment, their spiritual wisdom was so convicted of that truth that there was nothing else that they could do but to set up shop and say to you and I, God loves everyone just the way they are. Wow. What an amazing, amazing story. That's what we get to celebrate here on October the 3rd through the 5th. We get to celebrate 40 years of history. We get to celebrate that we're now reaping what other people have spiritually sown for us and made it possible for us to gather in a community like this right now, in this place, in a church building opposite the Armenian Evangelical Church without having stones thrown at us. And no longer do we have to put a fish outside to say where the Christians are meeting. We get to put a dirty, great big sign outside that street that says a fully inclusive community that lights up Los Feliz Corner and when it turns on at 8 o'clock at night. To live out loud. That's what we get to reap from those that have sown before us. In this seasons of giving, in this season of discernment, we get to reap what others have sown for us. We get to benefit from the people who put their money into the offering. We get to benefit who gave time and hours to establish a denomination and a church just like ours. We get to benefit from all of the good works that these folks have done for us, and we get to benefit from their hard graft and their labor as we sit here 40 years later. And for those of us who are first-time visitors here at this congregation, you get to reap the benefits of all of that just as we do, because we're all in the same boat together, whether we've been here once or whether we've been here since the first 12. We get to benefit one with each other. In this season of giving, in this season of spiritual discernment, you and I are confronted as we come home on this Sunday to think about how we might embody the mind of Christ today. How we might use that spiritual discernment today to convict us of the things that we should be doing. We said in our statement of vision and hope that we understand that God loves everyone just as they are, but we need to ask ourselves that deeper question about what is next for us. And we ask ourselves this morning in our own spiritual discernment in this season of giving one with each other, of taking that bare tree and putting some foliage on it, we ask ourselves, what is it? What is our purpose? What is it that God is calling us to now? How can we give so that those who come after us will benefit from what we have given? You know, if we're truly benefiting from the folks that came before us, it's our responsibility to allow our spiritual discernment, our spiritual ability, our season of giving to make a difference for those who will come after us. And it's not just about those that we get to see next week. You know, sometimes we're spiritually investing in this congregation the folks that we will never meet.